Hello everyone, welcome back to the Adkup Show. Today we are diving into something massive, literally massive, the US war in Afghanistan, which ran from 2001 to 2022, cost a jaw-dropping $2.31 trillion. Yeah, a trillion with a capital T, and that's not even the full story. There's human lives, hidden costs, and ripple effect on US economy that's still unfolding. I'll try to break this down step by step about how much the US spent, what it paid for, and what it means for America's wallet years down the line. So without wasting time, let's get into it. This all comes from a report by the Cost of War Project at Brown University's Watson Institute, published back on September 1, 2021. They have been tracking the price tag of America's post-9/11 wars for years, and Afghanistan is a big chunk of that story. The number they give us for the war in Afghanistan is $2.313 trillion. That covers everything from bombs to bases to rebuilding efforts in Afghanistan and even some operations in Pakistan. But here's the kicker. That's just the cash spent up to 2022. It doesn't include stuff like future vet care or the interest on all the money the US borrowed to pay for it. Spoiler alert, that's gonna add up. So what does $2.313 trillion actually buy you in a war? Let's slice this pie up. The biggest chunk, that is about 80%, went to the Department of Defense Overseas Contingency Operations, or OCOs for short. That's the military side. Troops on the ground, drones in the sky, Humvees rolling through the desert. We are talking about $1.85 trillion just to keep the war machine going. Now picture this. At its peak in 2011, we had 100,000 US troops in Afghanistan. That's a city's worth of people all needing gear, food, ammo every single day for years. Now, the Pentagon doesn't exactly hand out itemized receipts, and that's for the obvious reasons. They have been failing in their audit a lot, but we have got some solid estimates. A single soldier deployed overseas costs about $1 million per year. That's everything from their salary to fuel for their convoy. That's the estimated money the US spends. Multiply that by tens of thousands of troops across 2 decades, and you are already in hundreds of billions. Then toss it in high-tech toys like Black Hawk helicopters, that's $6 million each, and Predator drones, which runs about $4 million a pop, and on top of all that, their maintenance costs come separately. A B-2 bomber flight costs approximately $135,000 per hour. This stuff adds up fast. Next up, about $145 billion went to reconstruction. However, a lot of that money just went in corruption and not in real construction. Think about schools, roads, training Afghan cops and soldiers. The State Department and US aid, which recently got shut by a Trump administration, were the big players here, trying to build functioning country while bullets were still flying. Cool idea, right? Except a lot of it didn't stick. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, found billions got wasted on ghost schools that never opened or highways that crumbled because no one maintained them. One wild example is $43 million were spent on a gas station that should have costed just $500,000. That's some next level overcharging, or probably corruption is the right word. Then there's veteran care up to 2022. That's baked into the $2.313 trillion. Though the report doesn't break it out separately, we are talking medical bills for the 20,000 plus US troops injured plus disability payments. By 2021, over 400,000 vets from post-9/11 wars were on a disability, and many were from Afghanistan. A single vet with severe PTSD or a lost limb costs hundreds of thousands in care over their lifetime. But here's where it gets tricky. This $2.313 trillion stops at 2022. Future vet costs are not included. We'll circle back to that because it's a monster which is hiding under the bed. And finally, there's a miscellaneous stuff. Beefing of base security, stateside aid to Pakistan for letting the US use their airspace, even some cash went to fight opium production. which didn't exactly work out since Afghanistan's still the world's heroin capital. Actually, poppy cultivation contributes a major chunk to Afghanistan's GDP as country has no other means of income. However, according to many reports, poppy cultivation declined after US left Afghanistan. $2.313 trillion is a mountain of money. To put it in perspective, that's about $300 million per day for 20 years. Imagine what that could have bought. Universal healthcare, free colleges, a really nice yacht for every American. But let's pump the brakes on the money talks for a second, because this war wasn't just about cash, it was about people. The cost of war report says that at least 343,000 folks died directly from violence in Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's 70,000 Afghans and Pakistani civilians who were regular people caught in crossfire. Then 69,000 Afghan troops fighting alongside the US, 2,448 American soldiers, 3,846 contractors who were the private hires who don't always make the headlines, and over 66,000 Taliban or other fighters, plus a handful of journalists and aid workers. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Direct deaths are what you see in the news and media. Bombs, bullets, IEDs, etc., etc. But what about the indirect deaths? That's the silent killer. We are talking about starvation because farms got torched, kids dying of dysentery because water system were wrecked, moms losing babies because hospitals were rubbled. The report doesn't pin an exact number on Afghanistan alone, but across all post 9/11 wars, they estimate 3.6 million to 3.8 million indirect deaths. Afghanistan is a huge slice of that, maybe a million or more. It's hard to stomach, right? But that's the reality. One study from 2015 guessed 360,000 indirect deaths in Afghanistan by then, and that was the year before the end. And what about the survivors? Well, over 38 million people displaced across these wars, with millions from Afghanistan, refugees flooding into Pakistan or Iran, or just stuck wandering in their own country. Imagine picking up your whole life because your village is a war zone. By the way, Europe paid a heavy price because of all these wars. Refugees flooded into Europe in millions, and today Europe has no clue what to do with these refugees as their countries are still in rubble. This has brought massive socio-political and economic pressure on Europe. Then there is the vets. Hundreds of thousands with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, or worse. The report even mentions sexual assault in the military. 24% of women and nearly 2% of men who served in Afghanistan faced that trauma. This war didn't just cost money, it took lives in ways that we can't fully count. Okay, now let's get back to the money, because here's where it gets sneaky. The US didn't have that 2.313 trillion sitting in a piggy bank. The US borrowed a ton of it. Wars aren't cheap, and after 9/11, Congress wasn't about to raise taxes to cover it because that would be too unpopular. So the US slapped it on national credit card. By 2021, the costs of war folks estimated $2 trillion of post 9/11 war spending was borrowed, with Afghanistan being a big chunk of it. Give or take, let's say 1.5 trillion of that 2.313 trillion. Now, borrowing means interest, and interest is where it gets wild. The report doesn't include it in the $2.313 trillion, but they have got bigger estimates elsewhere. For all post 9/11 wars, they say interest could hit $6.5 trillion by 2050 if the US don't pay down the debt fast. Afghanistan's share would be maybe around $2 trillion of that, depending on how you slice it. Think about that. The US could end up paying almost as much as in interest as it did for the war itself. At today's rate, say 3% on treasury bonds, which is $45 billion a year just to service Afghanistan's debt chunk. And that rate could climb higher. Now let's do some quick math. Say the US borrowed $1.5 trillion for Afghanistan at 3% interest, paid over 30 years. That's $45 billion annually times 30. That is $1.135 trillion in interest alone. If rate jumps to 5%, which is not crazy with inflation these days, that's $75 billion a year or $2.25 trillion in total. This is money the US will not be spending on roads, schools, or tax cuts. It's just gone to bankers and bondholders. And we are not done yet. Veterans care is another elephant in the room. The $2.313 trillion covers what the US spent up to 2022. But what about the next 30, 40, 50 years? By 2021, over 1.9 million US troops had served in Afghanistan or Iraq, with most tied to Afghanistan at some point. Hundreds of thousands are already on disability. Think $50,000 a year per vet for severe cases. The Cost of War Project estimates future vet care for all post-9/11 wars could hit $2.2 to $2.5 trillion by 2050, and Afghanistan's share is probably around $1 trillion or even more. That's not the pocket change. The VA's budget in 2023 was $301 billion, and it's climbing every year as these vets age. A 2022 study from Harvard Kennedy School pegged lifetime care for post-9/11 vets at $2.3 trillion through 2050, and that's all conservative figures. Afghanistan's vets are a huge part of that. Amputation, mental health, you name it. We are talking about roughly $30 billion a year, every year for decades. Add that to interest and suddenly this $2.313 trillion war is looking more like $5 trillion when dust settles. Now let's not forget the environmental tab. The US military carbon footprints during these wars was nuts. 69 million metric ton of CO2 from 2001 to 2017 as per Brown's data. Afghanistan's base, jet fuels, and convoys were a big piece of that. Cleaning that up or dealing with the climate blowback costs money too, though it's harder to pin it down. Point is that this war's price tags keeps on growing. So how does this hit the US economy? First off, that $2.313 trillion was about 10% of the US GDP in 2021, and US GDP in 2021 was around $23 trillion. Spread over 20 years, it's about 0.5% of GDP annually. It's not a collapse, but not nothing. The real sting is the debt. The national debt is at over $36 trillion today, and as of March 17, 2025, the Afghanistan's borrowing added at least $1.5 trillion to that pile. Every dollar the US spends on interest is a dollar not going to jobs, infrastructure, or cutting taxes. Economists argue about this stuff. Some say war spending boosts the economy. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon made bank on Afghanistan, right? Jobs in defense spiked. Sure, but it's a sugar high. A 2020 study from American Economic Review found every $1 billion in military spending create fewer jobs than the same amount in education or green technology, which is about 1,500 jobs versus 2,500. Plus, a lot of that $145 billion in reconstruction just vanished overseas. That's all corruption which was gone to Afghan warlords or shady contractors, not the US workers. In the long term, it's the debt that bites. The US debt to GDP is over 120% now, higher than post-World War II levels. A chunk isn't the whole problem, but it's a brick in the wall. If interest rates climb to 4% or 5%, and with inflation ticking up, that's not wild. The US could be shelling out $1 trillion a year on total debt interest by 2030. Afghanistan $45 to $75 billion slice of that squeezes budgets. Congress have to cut Medicare, high taxes, or just keep borrowing, kicking the can down the road. And then the US got vets, which is $1 trillion in future care locked in. The US owes it to them and there is no cushion about it, but it's another weight on the economy. Less money for innovation, more for maintenance. Some folks like economist Joseph Stiglitz, who wrote The $3 Trillion War, says these wars tanked America's global edge, diverting cash from R&D or infrastructure that China's been pouring into. But when you are spending $300 million a day to lose a war by replacing the Taliban with Taliban, it's hard to argue it was a slam dunk investment. So now the question is, was it worth it? The $2.313 trillion got the US 20 years of fighting, a Taliban takedown in 2001 and a Taliban takeover in 2021. Osama bin Laden is gone. Mission was accomplished there, but Al-Qaeda is still kicking. Afghanistan is a mess with poverty going up. Women's rights are toast. The US got a bloody nose, 2,448 dead soldiers, and a $5 trillion tab when you count the long game. Meanwhile, that money could have rebuilt every bridge in America or wiped out student debt twice over. Look, I'm not here to say what should have happened, but the numbers don't lie. This war cost the US $2.313 trillion upfront, probably $5 trillion total, broke countless lives, and left the US with a bigger debt headache. It's a lesson in what wars really cost. Not just the bullets, but decades of bills that follow. So what do you think? Was it worth it or waste? Drop your take in the comments. That's it for today, folks. If you like this deep dive, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell icon. We have got more big topics coming. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.